You muted yourself, Dr. Hall. We can't hear you.
Okay, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and for being here on time. I am Geneve Phillip-Durham. I'm currently the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University College of the Cayman Islands, also the co-chair for CSA 2024 St. Lucia and a member of the Executive Council of the Caribbean Studies Association. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to session number 3, where we seek to explore Caribbean voices and bridge knowledge across borders. So this evening, before I get into introducing our presenters, I just want to remind you all about the CSA 2025 conference to be held on the island of St. Martin from June 1st to 7th with the theme Reparations, Resistance, Resilience, Reproduction, and Rehabilitation. So before we begin, I'll turn you over to Dr. Hall for remarks, who is the coordinator of CSA Voices. Over to you, Dr. Hall.
All right, thank you very much. Welcome everyone to CSA Voices. CSA Voices is really a platform where we want to hear from the scholars working in the Caribbean and across the world. We feel as an organization coming out of the St. Lucia conference that after we present our papers at these annual conferences, that's where it ends. We don't communicate much with each other. And so the mandate out of the St. Lucia conference was that we need a platform where we can share our ideas, know what the research that is taking place in the region, and just be familiar with each other. So thank you very much, everyone, the presenters, our moderator, the president, uh, and those who are joining to support CSA Voices. Our executive voted that it will be a continuous event and not only an event leading up to the St. Martin conference. So we will have CSA Voices. And we also have a web page for CSA Voices. We have created a web page so you can go on the web page and see the previous events there, and the presenters and all of those different things. So welcome everyone, and we're happy to have you. And I know that we have some great presentations today. Over to you,
Thank
Don.
you, Dr. Hall. And while we await remarks from the president, we'll just go ahead and get started. She's a bit delayed for this afternoon and sent her regards for that. But I do want to recognize and to appreciate the fact that this evening's presentations are very much in keeping with the overarching theme of reparations, resistance, resilience, reproduction, and rehabilitation. And we would hear a number of presentations that span the Anglophone, Francophone, Spanish speaking Caribbean on the topic of emancipation. So, to begin this evening's presentations, we will hear from Dr. Shani Roper, and I will introduce each speaker before they present. So, Dr. Shani Roper, PhD, is curator of the University of the West Indies Museum and a Caribbean social historian. She was a part of the Jamaican delegation to repatriate a specimen of the presumed extinct giant Jamaican gully swap from University of Glasgow, Scotland, under the University of Glasgow MOU, the first return of a natural history specimen to the region. Her scholarship explores colonial and contemporary collecting practices, museums, educational practices, and histories of trauma in Black majority contexts in museums, as well as histories of Caribbean childhoods, social policy, and poor relief in the 19th and early 20th century Caribbean. She's currently co-president of the Museums Association of the Caribbean and chair of its education and programming committee. So Dr. Shani Roper will be presenting on contested heritage in the Caribbean, the case of Emancipation Day. Over to you, Dr. Roper.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to participate with our regional organizations. We're all very important to bridging a lot of the gap that we operate in. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk about a program that started out during COVID called Emancipation Day. So I'm going to share my screen. And let me just go to, all right, hold on, wait, there's my, let me do this over. Let me stop share. I have a lot of things on my screen. Hold on. All right, that, then full screen. All right.
So while we wait for Dr. Roper to get started, feel free to post your questions in the chat. We will have the Q&A followed by all of the presentations. So just ask you to sit tight while we go through the presentation, starting with Dr. Roper. All set?
Okay. All right. Can everybody see my screen? It's not in presenter mode, but it's fine.
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay, so COVID-19 really provided a very important opportunity for persons in the museum sector to pivot and respond to what was really a move from face-to-face to virtual world. But it also was a moment of tense socioeconomic change that produced a lot of social unrest. And it really coalesced around these ideas of contested heritage and the continued legacies of colonialism and imperialism, more broadly speaking, in independent nations, but in some cases, still present-day colonies. So some of the major events, if you all remember, would be Rhodes Must Fall, Bees Must Fall, Black Lives Matter, the toppling of the Coastal Monument in the United Kingdom. And as these global movements unfolded, the Caribbean then also participated in these discussions. And it really made heritage a site it was all so that's it's not that it was new, but it brought it back to the forefront as being sites of contestation, construction of a national identity versus the legacies of colonialism. And the Caribbean joined this conversation. So I have four images here. One was for the Nelson must go from Bridgetown, Barbados. The other one is for want of a reinterpretation. I won't use the word defacing. It was a reinterpretation of the Josephine monument in the French Caribbean. And also this last one, which is not as clear, is actually the Columbus statue that's in Trinidad, right? So there was a lot of challenges to these sites that were declared as being colonial, right? But one of the issues that I had as both as a historian and a cultural worker was that a lot of the discussions in the Caribbean were really not reflective of the tensions in the region, meaning that a lot of our monuments, our colonial era monuments and sculptures and so on, exist alongside post-independence, especially in the English Caribbean, post-independence structures. And what in essence happened is that for a lot of people, those two blurred together. But then you have this world discussion, and then we say, oh, look, we have these colonial monuments here. So coming out of it, the museum, and sorry, there was decolonized this place for museums as well. So the museum engaged in two virtual series. One being Monuments in the Caribbean, in which we invited historians and artists to talk about where they were how they were thinking about heritage and monuments and navigating post-colonial legacies in an independent space. The second program, which is really where my presentation focuses today, is the Emancipation Day Matters series. So Emancipation Day Matters was a 3-part series, and I engaged in this series specifically because in Jamaica there was a Don Anderson poll that advocated for the merging of Emancipation and Emancipation Day and Independence into one holiday. Regularly, Emancipation Day is one day, and then Independence Day is another day, but usually ends up being a fairly long, eventful period. People go on vacations, their parties, their cultural events, and so on and so forth. But there was the poll said that 60% of people polled did not think that you needed to have this kind of separation of the days. Now, for me as a historian, and I think for a lot of my colleagues in the field, this is extremely problematic. Now, if one is familiar with the history of Emancipation Day in the region, which is for the English-speaking Caribbean more specifically, with the exception of Antigua and Barbuda, Emancipation Day is 1838, Antigua and Barbuda is 1834. And there were regular Emancipation Day celebrations right into the 1880s and into the 20th century. It is at the construction of the Jamaican national state in the 1960s that you have a doing away or a movement away from radical histories around Jamaican identity. And it's not until the 90s with the commission of symbols that you have Emancipation Day coming back into being as an important holiday. So I felt as a scholar that the Jamaica case was too isolated. And maybe we needed a series of conversations across the region about what Emancipation Day really means. So we had 3 in total. The first one being Emancipation Day Matters, Materiality and Cultural Contestation in Jamaica. And Lisa, Lee Moinston, and Bernard Jenke, who transitioned last year, I think it was, all participated and reflected upon Emancipation Day. It was done in partnership with the Center for Reparations Research. The second one, which is really this one here, was done in collaboration with the Department of History at University of the West Indies Cayville campus. And we had presentations here from Candia, who is part of that panelist here, Winston Fulgence from St. Lucia, Dr. Pemberton from Trinidad, and Marcia Burrows from Barbados. And what these conversations did by focusing on Emancipation Day celebrations in Tobago, Grenada, Barbados, and St. Lucia it really helped to provide this bird's eye view. I mean, Barry Higman had argued in the 70s that it was important to do this comparative analysis of emancipation. And what became clear in these presentations that the issue of a contested national and contested holiday celebrating or commemorating rather and memorializing the most violent components of Caribbean history of enslaved society. There is actually a constant tension playing itself out in the region around Emancipation Day. Do we acknowledge Emancipation Day? Rather, a section of society wants it to happen. They want to have this discussion. And the celebration or engagement with emancipation is not just historical, it's contemporary, and it's in the case of Grenada, as Dr. Hall will talk about, that it's constantly being contested, the forms that come out of Emancipation Day celebrations that are in many ways very Afrocentric. There is also the tension there about cultural expression. But it meant that it was very important for us to have this discussion because the struggle for the commemoration of emancipation is not just a historical moment, it's a continuous area of navigation in Caribbean societies. The third session was a further comparison, which is that we had presentations from the French, Dutch, and Spanish Caribbean. And the entire program in and of itself was geared toward um, an English-speaking audience, specifically because in many ways we tend to operate in silos in the Caribbean. This is something that we see definitely happening in the Museums Association of the Caribbean, and it's usually a struggle to have conversations occur with each other, because even though we're in the Caribbean, we exist as different socio-political institutions. So French Caribbean, very often we might think that the gaze is in French. Dutch Caribbean, the gaze is with the Dutch Caribbean and with the Netherlands. And the Spanish Caribbean has its own nuances. And so in many ways, it's very important to find uh, tools or roads or ways to facilitate a cross-cultural conversation. Sometimes we can do it with simultaneous interpretation. Sometimes it doesn't happen. So in this case, Katerina, Professor Allen, and Professor Gusto did, I pronounced it wrong, but they each did a presentation for Puerto Rico, for the Dutch Caribbean, and for the French Caribbean. And for me, as a scholar, as a colleague, it was so important. There are things that you take for granted as a English-speaking Caribbean historian that doesn't necessarily translate into the other spaces. And the work around compensation for abolition that happened um, in Puerto Rico is very important, right? Because it's actually not something that's spoken about. When we speak about reparations, actually, the places that dominate the discussion are Haiti and the English Caribbean, where you have payment for compensation for enslaved persons at the point of abolition. A similar thing happens in Puerto Rico, but it doesn't come to the forefront of the discourse. And so really this discussion on emancipation opened a door for an additional intervention in that area. Prof. Rosemary Allen's work on the Dutch Caribbean really kind of, she thinks about emancipation, and I think this is a common thread in presentations. Emancipation is a long process. It's not just the day that it happens, but it is the continuous restructuring and navigating of legacies of enslavement and colonialism beyond that moment. How do we construct a transformative society, even though we do not engage in the dismantling of the very structures that supported enslavement? And by looking at the Dutch Caribbean, it's presenting a counter narrative to how we understand Caribbean slave societies. That's usually, if you're from the English Caribbean, your imagination is how slave societies function in the Caribbean. And we do learn in the literature that there are different types of slave societies, but we actually, in many ways, unless you're engaging it, you don't actually are, the average person is not really aware of what the nuances are, and the fact that emancipation happens later in the Dutch Caribbean, and by nature of the Dutch enslaved and post-slave society, that emancipation happens in its own way there. In the case of the French Caribbean, Katerina provided a comparative analysis around the multiple days of memory, right? Meaning that the French state has an idea of what days are supposed to be commemorated and navigated around the histories of enslavement, while in Guadeloupe and Martinique, there's days form a key part of this memory, and there's a tension that goes back and forth beyond that. Now, the culmination of these presentations was a special issue that just came out from Social and Economic Studies, in which my colleagues Candia and Lisa who are here, as well as the Dutch, French, and Spanish Caribbean papers, were all part of they provided this kind of understanding or reflection on the ways in which Emancipation Day is not only contested, but can be reimagined. And I think the lesson learned for me, especially, is that it's so important for us to engage in these conversations because they not only generate new knowledge, but they really allow us to think more broadly about some of the work that is there to be engaged in, even if we by ourselves as scholars are not engaging in our own research cross-cultural or cross-country work. It is, it's very useful to have these multiple conversations, which I think, of course, is also at the forefront of the work of CSA. So, I welcome any questions, and I hope that this provides an overview of the project and the impetus that brings us to point of doing why Emancipation Day matters and why it continues to be contested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roper. Certainly appreciated the insights into some of the colonial sites in the Caribbean and centering your discussions on the extent to which the conversations have evolved from 1838/1834 in the case of Antigua Barbuda to now. And let me see if President Arundel is here, because as we speak, last week we still had St. Martin having to push back against those colonial sentiments being expressed coming from metropolitan Netherlands. And I just want to read a short quote from the leader of the Far Right Forum for Democracy, Baudet, saying that St. Martin should be repopulated with hundreds of thousands of Dutch nationals to bring the island completely under control. And those are some of the colonial and racial supremacy, demographic engineering, imperial nostalgia sentiments that continue to be expressed in the case of St. Martin. So I know perhaps President Arundel would want to comment when she joins us, but really appreciate the discussion. And with that, we go immediately to our second presenter, Dr. Candia Mitchell-Hall, who is a lecturer of Caribbean Civilization and Material Culture and campus coordinator of the foundation course, Caribbean Civilization, at the Institute of Caribbean Studies, the UWI Mona campus. Her research includes the memories and heritage of the Afro-Grenadian peoples and their revolutionary histories, memorialization strategies, and historic resistance through cultural performances. She's a proud Grenadian daughter of the soil and Caribbeanist at heart. So her topic for this evening is Jab Jab, Emancipation and Resistance in Grenada. So over to you, Dr. Hall.
Thank you very much, Geneve, and greetings, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to present my research findings on this topic, Jab Jab, Resistance and Emancipation, Black Emancipation in Grenada, which is essentially a pullout of a paper that was recently published in the Journal of Social and Economic Studies entitled Jab Jab, The Struggles for Black Emancipation in Grenada. As mentioned, I am a Grenadian daughter of the soil, but I spent my formative years with a very limited understanding of the historical, social, and political significance and meanings of Jab Jab. Jab Jab was largely feared by some members of the community due to, of course, its very grotesque aesthetics, including the blackening of the skin with old oil, grease, soota, molasses, and emblems like chains and cattle horns and so on. So there is and was the prevailing sentiment that Jab Jab make loud noises and disrupt or disturb the peace with the blowing of conch shells, whistles, the beating of goat drums, tin pans, and chants. And so the general perception I had of Jab Jab while growing up in Grenada came from the literal explication of the name and the sort of limited understanding of all of its sociocultural and historical meanings in the Grenadian society. For the non-Grenadian listeners, and I am commit me to share my slide in PowerPoint format. There are many listeners who may not know about Jab Jab, but what it is a Black Grenadian cultural expression that is portrayed during Carnival, which is called Spice Mass in Grenada. The name Jab Jab is a reiteration of a French Creole expression, diable, diable, meaning devil, devil. And it is a contested expression that is often demonized as a form of devil worship or an expression of obeah. Actually, during slavery, the planters referred to the enslaved peoples as diable or devils and would punish them to remove what they called the devil from within, a signifier clearly of the enslaved people's resistance strategies during slavery. So I approach Jab Jab from both a grounded and situated lens and an academic position as an insider, outsider. As a Grenadian daughter of the soil, I have never performed Jab Jab or participated in Jab Jab. So my real understanding of Jab Jab came from academic rigor. But of course, I also know that my work has been shaped and emboldened by the tradition of resistance for true emancipation in Grenada. And I plan on participating in this very rich Afro-Grenadian expression of resistance and emancipation to contribute to the memory work as a performer of emancipation sometime in the near future. So this is what Jab Jab looks like. And my research on Jab Jab was shaped out of a primary question that I had while conducting research on how Emancipation Day was commemorated in Grenada. The sources that I found dealt with the ways that the elites and the middle classes, non-Jab Jab, commemorated Emancipation Day from their lens. So these sources would provide the perspective of the elites and it would ignore the position of the Black community. I felt a certain disquiet about reading and thinking emancipation from what I would consider a top-down approach. And several questions would begin to probe the mind concerning how the Black community would have commemorated their emancipation. I also spoke to some colleagues about where this research was taking me, but this research lead was too great to turn back. And so I continued in my quest to understand how and in what space did the Black community commemorate their emancipation. Because for me, Black community must have commemorated emancipation in some way, shape, or form. But where would I find the answers to these questions? Which space did the Black community utilize to commemorate and resist the kind of emancipation that they were being offered? And to what extent did the Black community utilize cultural expressions and within this context, Jab Jab, to perhaps critically comment on the conditions of emancipation? And so my questions led me to another question. Is there a link between Carnival and emancipation in Grenada? And was and is Carnival a space of emancipation in Grenada? Of course, to be clear, this is not the first time that this question has been raised. It was raised in 1983 by Professor of History, Bridget Brereton, who had asked a similar question in an essay that she called The Birthday of Our Race, where she would wrestle with this notion of whether the Black community had utilized Carnival to commemorate emancipation in 1838. And Brereton would make the point that ex-slaves showed very little interest in state and church commemoration, so they must have celebrated emancipation in their own way. The work presents convincing oral histories illustrating how Carnival was used to commemorate emancipation, but she rejects those positions due to what she calls a lack of references in newspapers to establish a link between Emancipation Day commemorations and Carnival. So in many ways, Veriton's work would connect Carnival with emancipation, but there were several questions that were left unanswered. And this is where I tried to fill the gap on these questions. So I would utilize a mixed methodological approach to fill in these gaps in the historiography. I conducted one, primary sources, mining through old newspapers written in 1834, 1838, like the Grenada Free Press. And this source would confirm that the Black community made what it called a lot of noise, although it did not specify how and why the noises were made. And then I conducted interviews in Grenada to collect oral memory, traditions, testimonies, and also questionnaires on social media to understand how Jab Jab is perceived in the Grenadian society. I conducted interviews widely with Jab Jab practitioners, promoters, Grenadians who experienced different moments from the 1950s. I would utilize content analysis, reading secondary sources, articles like those dealing with performance cultures. Many proved very productive. And of course, I would come across critically the works of Brereton, Earl Lovelace, Marcia Burroughs for Barbados, Higman for Jamaica. And these would lead me to consider Jab Jab, this Black Grenadian cultural expression, and to authors like Sulin Chutong, who would write a work called Molasses Devil. And then, of course, it dawned on me that I could utilize the performance itself of Jab Jab as a source of information. That Jab Jab becomes text, Jab Jab becomes archive of memory. And within this context, I found that Jab Jab reperform and rememorize historic resistance spanning this very long duration of emancipation. Dr. Roper spoke to this shortly a while ago. So when does Jab Jab begin? And this was one of the questions that had to be resolved. How does it play out? And so Jab Jab would appear during Juve, which is French Creole for dawn of a new day at 4-day morning, sort of symbolic intervention or platform in the celebration of Carnival to commemorate emancipation. And this Juve is important. It is the first and dominant celebration of the 2-day carnival and was often seen as a literal conceptualization of the dawning of a new day for those who were previously enslaved. In other words, it metaphorically reflects the transition from night to daylight and represents a space of freedom, as it would signify the coming of true emancipation. So Jab Jab would perform and satirize, mock the elites, namely the planters and the masters, as the real devils of their existence during Juve. They would personify the planter as an oppressive figure, notably a father figure with a whip over the back of an enslaved man or child, and one who would hold a stout staff representing an aroused male genital organ. And of course, there are so many meanings that I cannot get into here in this very short time span. But the Jab Jab performance includes the collective processing in the streets to resist oppression, white domination, by displaying their strength, their authority, unity, and uniformity, and but to also appropriate power through their cultural performance. So what do I do with all of these findings? Well, I make several arguments in the paper that are largely interconnected. The first is that Jab Jab is central to the understanding the struggles for true freedom and emancipation in Grenada, not only in the past, but also in the present, which is what I attempt to do for this paper. By way of context, the work begins by presenting the historical context for Jab Jab, including its origin stories, how it originated, the ideas that we hold in Grenada about the origins of Jab Jab. One, that Jab Jab evolved from the Ekpe festival from Nigeria, which the Yoruban peoples brought when they arrived in the 1700s. Another, that Jab Jab emerged during slavery uh, under another name, harvest festival called Pan Brûlé or Pan Brûlé, French for burning cane, which involved a torchlight procession and the parade of both the planters and the field slaves. right, who would perform a kind of Saturnalia. So in that festival, both the planters and the enslaved would blacken the skin with the soot from the burned canes. So that's one popular view. But the most popular view I found is that Jab Jab ascended in the post-emancipation period, where it is largely believed that pan brulee evolved into Jab Jab. And so I would then, second argument, underscore how Jab Jab would intervene in moments of extreme inequality and injustice. So that argument was important, especially to highlight how the performance of Jab Jab would be used to increase the grotesque nature of its resistance or its resistance strategies to comment on its dissatisfaction with conditions in the Grenadian society. And thirdly, I argue that Jab Jab provides a reparative framework to understand historical injustice. And perhaps very quickly, I'll be able to explain how Jab Jab actually reperform historical injustice across time and space. So how did I organize my findings? My findings are divided into 6 sections. The first section, the introduction, sets the historical tone for Jab Jab. And then I highlight 5 moments of injustices in which Jab Jab would become more pronounced in the critique of the socioeconomic, economic, and political conditions in the society. The first section is entitled The Cultural Politics of Emancipation, and it captures the first moment of injustice explored in my analysis. It draws on the moment of apprenticeship when Afro-Grenadians would protest the withholding of emancipation for 4 and 6 years. And it is at this moment that it is largely believed that pan brulee, the joint harvest festival shared between planters and enslaved peoples, evolved into Jab Jab, as the apprentices would insist on marking a change to their conditions. And then the work would examine the ways in which Afro-Grenadians contested the conditions of emancipation in 1838, which is the second point here on the slide. Emancipation had come with no material change to the socio-economic and economic conditions of the people. So they contested the compensation that was given to the planters for Black emancipation. And they lamented that they had not even received a shilling or even a square inch of land to help them construct freedom. In Grenadian collective memory, it is largely believed that the Black community commemorated emancipation in 1838, despite reports from the Grenada Free Press that there wasn't what they call, as I mentioned before, a lot of noise on that day. But according to oral tradition, the Blacks commemorated emancipation in church and on the streets as an intervention during the period of carnival and not on the day that was assigned officially as Emancipation Day, as it had not brought any changes to their conditions, materially or otherwise. A third moment that I would examine would be the long post-emancipation period, where Jab Jab would protest the ban on Jab Jab itself, which would be defined as obeah. And of course, they would also protest the worsening economic conditions in the 20th century. High rents, low wages, poor working and living conditions, horrible healthcare, etc. So how would Jab Jab respond to these moments of injustices? How would Jab Jab pronounce its critique on the Grenadian society through performance? But Jab Jab would respond with a jab chant that is called Pay the Devil, Pay the Jab, a copper. And just to provide a few details about the text, it is the oldest jab chant on record. It can be traced to 1920, and which is, of course, 8 decades into the post-emancipation period, not a very long time after emancipation in 1838. It comprises about 7 lines expressed in French Creole and English Creole, which I've included here on the PowerPoint. Itile, itilambe, itile, itila, gijaba copper, to pay passage, to go back to hell. So in my reading of the song, I found that it provides more than a literal reading of paying Jab Jab money or a copper to return to a place he considers as hell. In the broader paper, I actually argue that this Jab chant provides a reparative reading framework to understand how cultural performances can be utilized and was utilized by Jab Jab to critique the Grenadian society. In other words, I analyze the song as a text, speaking directly to reparative justice and injustice to understand how Jab Jab responded to an emancipation that did not repair the historical injustices of slavery and colonization. So just a little snippet of this. The devil is a metaphor for the planter, and not the Black victims of slavery and colonization, while hell could be considered a metaphor for the plantation and the lived experiences of the Grenadian Jab Jab. But in this reperformance, hell is not only a metaphorical place, it is a place of daily social, economic, and political death for the Jab Jab. As the lowest dominator within the currency system, the copper suggests that freedom was cheap, as so-called emancipation did not transform the economic fortunes of the emancipated. So how exactly does Jab Jab reperform this this reparative act, so to speak? So Jab Jab would dramatize hellish scenes to draw attention to his poor conditions, including terrifying faces, rolling his eyes all around, clicking his long fingernails made of tin, batting his tongue in and out of his mouth, etc., etc. Jab Jab would also demand coppers from non-performers while chanting this song, Pay the Jab, a copper, pay the devil. They would attempt to what I call blackmail non-performers to secure cash. So Jab Jab would walk for miles, appearing at elite homes and businesses to extract their payment for their conditions. And ultimately, refusal to patronize Jab Jab would result in the smearing of homes and businesses of the elites as a sign of Jab Jab's ritual badness and assumption of power. There is so much more that the work goes into, which time does not afford. But one of the moments that I deal with, the fourth one, is the role of Jab Jab in the decolonial struggles for the next iteration of emancipation, namely independence. And so I focus on two prominent figures, Theophilus Albert Marshall, who is seen here on the slide, and Eric Gary, who would embody the physical and social Blackness of Jab Jab as descendants of marginalized Blacks who would rise to become voices in the struggle for the rights of the people. Of course, these figures were not bedaubed in the old oil, or they were not oiled down in a literal sense, but they would certainly make seminal contribution to the people's struggles for true emancipation, and would come to be seen as in the same vein as Jab Jab, as dangerous rebels or bêtes noires, black beasts, which is how Jab Jab was considered by the elites and the middle classes in the Grenadian society. Finally, my final section, entitled Rememorizing Revolutionary Emancipation, would look at the most recent and contemporary resistance of Jab Jab. It spans the Grenada Revolution to the COVID-19 Carnival Cancellation August Celebration Act, which was passed in 2020 and 2021. And this act would ban Jab Jab from performing at Carnival. This section focuses on the politics of opposition to the Gary government, and it would argue that Maurice Bishop, a very popular lawyer who would overthrow Gary, would be seen as the new force of emancipation in Grenada. Actually, the work would also argue that the birth of the Grenada Revolution on 13 March reperformed the resistance strategies of Jab Jab across historical junctures. And I will share just a few ideas here. Firstly, I read Maurice Bishop's radio address, which he called A Bright New Dawn, as a call to resistance, echoing Jab Jab's grammar of resistance. Jab Jab performed its resistance to emancipation during Juve, which is seen as the new dawn. And so Bishop's first address to the nation has often been seen as part of a discourse on the revolutionary histories, which of course began with Jab Jab and would be a continuation of the resistance strategies of the Afro-Grenadian peoples. And then, of course, the burning of Gary's police barracks to the ground, to me, reenacted the Can Brûlée, the deliberate burning of the sugarcane by the enslaved peoples. And the list goes on and on. Finally, I argue that the recent Jab Jab contestation to the Carnival Cancellation Act during COVID provides a lens to understand emancipation in the present, something that has often been divorced from our present understanding of freedom making within our Caribbean societies. I argue that the recent cancellation and the defiance of Jab Jab would evoke the political agency of the Afro-Grenadian peoples, who would make political statements about changing the political landscape of Grenada with comments like, we're putting a jab in parliament. And we would see 1 year later in 2022, for the first time in 14 years, the opposition party, the National Democratic Congress, was voted into power, and a proponent of Jab Jab, Deacon Mitchell, a popular lawyer from one of the dominant areas of Jab Jab, became the youngest elected prime minister of Grenada. And I remember exactly where I was when the resistance strategy played out, and it would stir my imagination concerning the value of Jab Jab to speak to the current socio-economic tensions and political tensions in the society and resistance to inequity, right? Especially to Jab Jab itself. So I do not have time to go into what happened next. But if you want to understand what happened next, you would have to purchase the Journal of Social and Economic Studies. In my conclusion, I make some conclusions that are interventionist in nature. As an insider outsider of Jab Jab, I aim to make some suggestions that I think would help to repair the sort of negative perception and narratives assigned to Jab Jab. It is, of course, Grenada's most contested and loved cultural expressions. Firstly, it is important for the non-Jab Jab groups in the Grenadian and Caribbean societies to understand the role of Jab Jab in intervening in moments of injustice and alienation. Emancipation did not repair the conditions of the masses. It was quite disrespectful to the Black community, as it offered no real form of material change to their conditions. And it would open them up to further inequalities in the society. Hence, Jab Jab is a manifestation of injustice. The true devils were not Jab Jab. The true devils were those who oppressed and marginalized Jab Jab due to the color of the skin. Secondly, it must be understood that Jab Jab saved the masses from social, political, and economic death, as the Black disguise provided opportunities for Jab Jab to appropriate and access power. So all in all, ultimately, it is imperative for Grenadians, for Caribbean people to recognize that Jab Jab is an important expression of resistance and the quest for true emancipation across time and space. This is the end of my presentation. I thank you for listening. Hopefully, we'll engage in the question and comment section.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hall. Excellent. I think people are really enjoying how this evening is progressing, and I do want us to leave sufficient time for question and answer. So, a lot for us to take away. I think I saw immediate past president very much interested in getting that on her bucket list, as am I, playing the job in Grenada, but definitely not our biggest takeaway, of course. Our biggest takeaway is the demonization of our cultural expressions and expressions of resistance that have been shaped in part by our colonial experiences. And I think it's very important for us to continue to problematize these facts as we engage in various forms of advocacy and activism for and on behalf of our shared regional space, including, of course, Grenada, Carriacou, and PT Martinique. So with that, I take you to our third and final presenter for this evening, Dr. Lisa Tomlinson, who is a senior lecturer and head of the Department of Literatures in English at UWI Mona campus. She's the author of the African Jamaican Aesthetic, Cultural Retention, and Transformation Across Borders, and Una Masson from the Caribbean Biography series. Her expertise lies in Caribbean and African diaspora, film, literary studies, and visual culture. Lisa is currently the Deputy Festival Director and Chief Judge for the GATFest Film Festival, as well as the Chief Adjudicator for the Aficulture Short Film Competition and the Creative Writing Competition for the JCDC. She also designs and delivers film and creative writing workshops for the JCDC, and her topic for this evening is Representation of Emancipation in Anglophone Caribbean Literature, Annie John and White Sargasso Sea. So over to you. Over to you, Dr. Tomlinson.
Thank you, Geneve, and also O'Neill. I wanted to share my screen. Will I be able to share my screen?
Yes, you can. Please proceed with sharing your screen.
Okay, I'm coming right here. All righty. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
All righty. Okay. All right. So thank you very much, Genevieve and O'Neill, for having me here this evening. And I also want to thank Shani for putting this journal together about emancipation. And an even bigger thank you for including works of literature and also performative arts, as we just saw with Candia's presentation, Jab Jab. And I say that with a big heart, because oftentimes when we think about emancipation or independence in the Caribbean, we oftentimes divorce works of art from or culture from the conversation. We tend to focus on history, politics, and social, even sociology. So I'm really glad to be here this evening to share literature. I know it can be abstract, but I'm hoping this evening I'm able to take away, or we're able to take away looking at literature from a less abstract view and using it within a very tangible way as we discuss emancipation and within the Caribbean. Alrighty, so the paper more or less explores the representation of emancipation and also colonial periods, because it's very hard to separate emancipation and colonialism. So it looks at the two, and in doing so, it examines how authors, and while I'm looking at two specific books or novels, this can also be applied to other areas of literature, even poetry, drama, just how Caribbean literature more or less tends to depict historical moments. And I'm looking at particularly Caribbean literature in this context, because Caribbean literature reflects history. This is where we get a lot of historical material from, other than within, sitting in a history class. So how, in order to contextualize this historical mapping that I'm going to be using this evening, I want to draw on Lucas, or Gregory Lucas, the historical novel, which is a genre, and I'm going to use it to contextualize both novels. And I'm only going to take out very, bits and pieces of the novel. So before I get into the novels, Lucas' work, what it does, it traces the genesis and the importance of the historical novel as a genre. So it's not just a novel, but it's a genre, and it's ways in which writers write within these historical contexts, how they're documenting history. So he looks at it and he argues that its uniqueness lies in the ability to capture the spirit. So to capture the spirit of an entire nation. In doing so, it portrays, and this is where it becomes very important, because this is what, when we think about historical novels, it tends to focus a lot on prominent figures, but the traditional novels, when it looks at history. But for Lucas, he says, typical characters historical novels focuses on, they embody broader social and political movements. So he contrasts this with the traditional literature, where they often center on individuals, characters that are heroes. So they're heroes, and these heroes tend to come from the elite sector of society. And in doing so, he's also stressing the fact that Historical novels should focus not only on prominent figures and elite, as we see in Shakespearean plays, but they also need to be inclusive of the ordinary people. Because by including the ordinary people, what this historical novel does, it gives us, right, it gives the reader a more wholesome view of historical processes. In this context, the themes of colonialism and emancipation act as a backdrop for the particular books that I'm looking at this evening, for Annie John and White Sargasso Sea. While Annie John is not directly set in the Emancipation era, both novels share real-life history of enslavement and colonialism's lasting impact on the lives of the everyday. So you see the historical genre is really taking it from a very realistic perspective, the ways in which these characters, while fictional, how they engage and they interact with history, and in this case, emancipation. I also use Glissant, Edward G. Glissant's work, Prophetic Vision of the Past. And I use this concept specifically because in this concept, Glissant, he urges writers of not just a novel, but he urges Caribbean writers to use novel as a means, while they're also engaging history, as a means of engaging with trauma of colonial dispossession, while linking with not just the past, but with the future and also the present. So we see how these historical novel as a genre, not just looking at it as an event, but how the writers bring out these trauma, how they bring out memory, how this can all not be wrapped or confined to the past, but how we can also see them today, even within the discussion of emancipation. So unlike for Glissant, unlike the traditional novel, and this is not to throw out the traditional novel, I'm not throwing out the traditional novel under the bus, but unlike the traditional novel, which focuses on major events or official records, Glissant expands his approach by centering the lived experiences and realities, cultural memories, and oral traditions of Caribbean people. So I'll be using these two frames in order to contextualize my work. White Sargasso Sea. So White Sargasso Sea, for some of you, many of you are familiar with who've done literature, even in high school. White Sargasso Sea explores more or less, I'm turning over here. If you notice, I have the term race and emancipation and legacy. So I'm going to talk about that. So what we see here with White Sargasso Sea, it explores the struggle of white Creole characters as they attempt to redefine themselves and assert agency in the post-emancipation period. So when we talk about emancipation and we talk about race and the legacy of it within the context of emancipation, we tend to think of just Black and white. So the African population and the white European population. We oftentimes forget about the biracial, the term we would use today, the white Creoles and their relationship. So their relationship with each other, and even not just with each other, but within the historical period. So what was happening? So in White Sargasso Sea, it is set in the aftermath of the Emancipation Act 1833. It engages a period closely linked to post-emancipation. So unlike Annie John, which I'm going to talk about later, this work is set specifically within the period of emancipation. So we're able to see the direct sufferings and also the remnants of slavery, and how the characters, specifically Creole characters and the Black characters, how the complexity of how they negotiate liberation. And I should say more so the Creole characters, the white Creole characters, because again, we don't really tend to focus a lot on white Creole during this period. For what reasons? I guess it's our fixation on race as just Black and white. Bathy's Sam described White Sargasso Sea as a historical novel that captures the end of slavery and complex social dynamics of the newly liberated Caribbean community. So this newly liberated Caribbean community is really encompassing, it's really inclusive of the African Caribbean community. Hence, what the novel does, it looks at the relationship between the African and the white Creole residents, and the minority white population during this period who still maintains much of the power. So within this complex relationship or turbulence relationship, if I could say, and period of emancipation, Annette, who's a key character, and her daughter, Antoine, they find themselves trapped within this idea of identity. Who are they? They're neither accepted within the white population nor the Black population. So finding themselves trapped in these two situations, what they do, unfortunately, they straddle between the islands of Black and white, between the white British population. So Annette, the key character, she has and I quote here, her identity, or she has this fractured sense of self meaning who she is as a Caribbean person, as a, how does she fits in? And also her social status during this economic crisis. She loses everything. She becomes poor. Another myth that we tend to have sometimes in terms of white Creole acquiring this one heap of wealth, so to speak. So she greatly contributes. This now becomes a part of her isolation, where she's not a part of society. She's not a part of the newly liberated. And this is not to say the Black characters are fully liberated at all. It is to show the ways in which these different characters that we do not examine in the language of emancipation, we don't examine how they're affected by what we refer to as emancipation. And when we say emancipation, we talk about this liberation and freedom, but yet we see a character like Antoinette, who constantly, and her daughter, her family, who struggle to fit within a society because of their ranking, and especially because of their racial identity. And there's a quote that I share here on the slide in a conversation with Christophine, who's her, I don't like to use the word servant, but who's helps her out. She still maintains a servant despite the fact that she loses her rank within society, who takes care of her children and even her. And she says, a white cockroach, that's me. That is what they call all of us who were here before their own people in Africa, and then sold us to the slave traders. And I've heard women call us white niggers. So between you, I often wonder who I am and where is my country and where do I belong and why was I ever born at all? So this is very powerful. That this quote is very powerful because what it does, it captures Annette's isolation to the extent that she and her family, while she still has white in her, she and her family is reduced to an animal. So there's a kind of what's an insect. So we see that again, her ranking is very low within society, and she doesn't have that belonging as opposed to we see with Annie John, who is more affirmed within her self-identity and even belonging to a Caribbean community. So race treatment of the theme of emancipation is similarly unquestionable when examining the experience of the white Creole population, making it more difficult to challenge. Again, compared to Annie John, who's more seated, who's more concreted within her own society. So the persistent racial tension and alienation that Annette and her family must face, or she and her daughter, they experience mental breakdowns, right? So both characters, it becomes a psychological effect, something that needs to also be examined within the context of emancipation in its after fact. So this would go back to Glissant's idea of trauma, so not just focusing on the novels as just an event. At the same time, the white Sargasso Sea occurs during the early, because we have to also think about the time period that it's written in, because Annie John, as I said before, she's more affirmed within her identity, but also I note that as well, that white Sargasso Sea occurs during the early post-emancipation period in the British Caribbean, and where we still have these characters navigating plantation society, and these societies are marked by economic decline, because economic plays a very important factor within this discussion, emancipation as well. And also the risk, what we need to keep in mind here as well, this time period, there's a rise in Black consciousness and resistance. So the Black characters, which I said earlier, while they're not fully liberated because they're still being exploited through work or labor, their Black consciousness and resistance give them a more elevated, to a certain extent, status than, say, a character like Annette and Antoine, her daughter, who are white Creole, because again, they're less integrated within the community because of their isolation. Lastly, what I wanted to look at, I hope I'm not rushing too much. I don't know how much time I have. My slide is Liberating the Mind, Miseducation or Emancipation. And I use this particular slide to talk about going into Annie John now. Jamaica Kincaid's novel, Annie John, critically examines the history of Antigua. However, we're not looking at it again as a direct, like they're directly in colonialism or colonial society, excuse me. We're looking at it through an anti-colonial lens where the writer, Kincaid, she's highlighting the aftermath of British colonialism and its impact on the educational system and cultural identity. I won't get into the cultural identity, but I'll quickly go through the education system. So the pervasive influence of British culture is demonstrated through the school uniforms that Annie John and her friends have to wear. But more significantly, the books, right? The books that they are prescribed to read. And these books, we know, they heavily reflect Eurocentric, particularly British sensibility. So these books are literature and their history, right? So they're both books that are being used now to shape the identity in some shape, right, in some form. And they're also used to reinforce a superiority of British culture. So, for example, Shakespeare, The Tempest, and this is the book she's reading, Annie Paul, Annie John, excuse me. So she's reading Shakespeare's The Tempest, Milton's Paradise Lost. Also, the history book she's looking at is The Roman Britain and the History of the West Indies. So we know for many Caribbean people, their encounter with such literature acts as their first, as Kincaid says for her own self, it acts as their first introduction to England as a colonizing mother country, right? I had a very quick quote here where Kincaid says, I came to discover, she said, I discovered the world through England. And if the world desired to discover me, it would have to do so through England, right? End of quote. So what Kincaid recognizes here is that her sense of self, much like the other subjects of colonialism, became submerged by British culture because of this limitation, this idea of Britishness that were imposed by a colonial, not just a colonial system, but a colonial educational system that in many ways served to deprive Caribbean subjects of their own self-understanding. So what is very historical here, we see how history now is impacting, right? Again, going back to Glissant, how history is impacting not just the fact that the Antigua went through colonialism or was a plantation society, but how now they're being impacted by it through education. And then we see Annie John now challenges this colonial narrative of the so-called discovery of the Caribbean. And as I'm taking the word from Shani, as she said, it's not about defacing, because I have the word deface, but I'm going to change it now to reinterpreting. So she reinterprets Columbus' image in the textbook, A History of the West Indies, using her mother's words, the great man no longer just get up and go. And it takes great satisfaction in humiliating the British humiliator. And she adamantly rejects any glorification of Christopher Columbus, despite his respected status among her teachers and peers. So she challenges this idea, this notion of Christopher Columbus discovering the Caribbean by creating her own reinterpretation. And she does that by defacing his picture, or excuse me, reinterpreting his picture. How I love this picture. She says, how I love this picture, seeing the typical triumphs Columbus brought so low, seated at the bottom of the boat, mercilessly observing the things passing by. So clearly the image of Christopher Columbus restrained in, because there's also the image of him in chains, evokes this image of the humiliation and the despair that Africans also experienced as they crossed the Atlantic. So Annie goes to great lengths to take pride and to also restore right? The African Caribbean people. And not only just the restoring and taking great pride, but she's also, and that is something that I needed to mention earlier, she's rewriting, and we're getting it from a gender perspective as well. We're two women writers and the central characters are women. There's also two conversation around emancipation and colonialism always tends to be very much within a male centered, right? We don't really look at stories, their narratives coming, right, the ways in which women plays a role or also the impact. So Annie maintains her position of this idea of no Christopher Columbus, no guy, you did not discover the Caribbean, and which startles her teacher, her classmate, but nonetheless, this is the way in which Kincaid now challenges this notion of emancipation. For us, it's just, it might seem as, you know, just looking at education system that we don't like, but in the text, in the context, in the literary way, we see it as a great challenge. As I spoke about earlier, this idea of this anti-colonial lens where she's taking, she's resisting. And this is contrary to Stuart Hall, Sullivan Samuels, a writer, who they speak about their early experience and how they saw their educational system, how it was molded by Britishness. So they did not counteract it. They did not resist it the way we see Annie John. So in essence, almost finished, Annette, her character, more or less, we see that she's isolated from the Black population, her identity is fractured. So we're seeing the direct results of emancipation that we can learn from and we can see within today's society. Because I always say, and not in a mean way, but we, you know, as Caribbean people, unfortunately, sometimes because of this identity that we're constantly struggling to attain or to assert, we sometimes go through this idea of double consciousness, as Du Bois would say. I'm almost finished, Geneve. I know you're on because of that. And Annie John, colonial education now, this demonstrates the lingering effect of how colonialism, how colonialism is also threaded through our educational system and other systems that I don't talk about, but you can read the other the paper, how it also threads throughout other systems, particularly here, in this case, education. So in conclusion, in these novels, both authors, Kincaid and Jean Rhys, show how history and personal memory help to shape Caribbean narratives. They balance Lucas' framework, where they highlight historical events such as emancipation and colonial exploitation through the eyes of ordinary people, everyday people, with Glissant's approach, which foregrounds trauma and personal memory. By doing so, Kincaid and Rhys do more than just recount and tell historical events. They show how these events remain the memories of Caribbean people and can be and are very important in our discussion or conversation as we talk about emancipation. Thank you, Genevieve. I hope I was able to finish in time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really appreciated that, Dr. Tomlinson. The references made or the comparisons between Caribbean literature and its interaction with history, specifically emancipation. And in many respects, we see that the colonial dispossession that you mentioned and the trauma have continued well beyond the 19th and 20th century, and we are still grappling with these complexities as we interact across the remnants of empire in our region. So with that, I want to use this opportunity to issue a call to action to attend the St. Martin Conference, where we'll have the opportunity to explore more of these issues within the context of the theme, reparations, resistance, reproduction, and rehabilitation. So thank you to all of our presenters. And before we go to the Q&A, I just want to welcome, in the absence of Dr. Arundel, who I don't see here just yet, our Vice President, Professor Donna Hope, to bring us some brief remarks before we go to Q&A. And I will kick it off with the first question that I received from the chat once Professor Hope has wrapped up. Professor Hope, over to you.
Thank you so much, Geneve. And of course, I want to thank all the presenters. I came in a little late, so I only caught Candia, Dr. Michelle Hall's presentation and Dr. Tomlinson's, but very stimulating presentations. And I'm thankful that we are able to pull together, at this time of the semester for most people, these very stimulating and innovative presentation that bring a lot of information forward. And just a little aside, I am supposed to be dressing up at Grenada Carnival. I want to do the jab jab. I'm going there to be oiled and wrapped up in. Yes, I have a plan, so I'm working on it, Candia. We know I'm serious. We need to talk
We
because
have a
that
plan.
character, yeah, that character has always proven very intriguing for me. And listening to your presentation opened up a lot of other streams of thought. But I want to welcome everyone who has come in on behalf of the Caribbean Studies Association, our president, Dr. Rhoda Arundel, and the entire team. I also want to thank Dr. O'Neill Hall for conceptualizing the CSA Voices and really pulling it through with such efficiency and really pulling these masterful panels together that we can share knowledge across borders, giving thanks for the technology, so that others can be with us and listen to some of what CSA is sharing and showcasing along the way. And of course, thanking you, Geneve, for masterfully carrying the panel forward and guiding us into the Q&A, and looking forward, as you just said very aptly, to many of the persons here in the Zoom with us, joining us in St. Martin, the 1st to the 7th of June, where we'll have a stimulating conversation around many of the areas that are covered under the 4 main themes of the panel, which many of us are right now as we work through the kind of global and regional fractures that are taking place. We are considering and contemplating with more energy. So thank you, everyone. Over to you, Geneve, for the Q&A, and looking forward to the next round of CSA Voices. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have the first question for Candia. Liana Mason was wondering, how are you considering the tension between the more recent marketing and commercialization of Jab Jab in the argument of Jab Jab as an intervention of resistance to injustices and inequities? So in just 1 minute and a half, if you
Let's
have
see.
response, so we take some more questions.
Let's see. Let's see. Well, thank you, Liana. We met at the Grenada conference. The work does consider, in a very brief way, the sort of context for the COVID-19 Cancellation Act, which is, of course, the ban on jab jab by corporate statutory body, Spice Mass Corporation, which is the statutory body that is charged with promoting and marketing jab jab. The idea here is that Jab Jab has been centralized to the capital city and not the rural areas where it emerged from, and which, of course, historically would respond to these conditions in the society by performing Jab Jab. And so what Spice Mass Corporation did was that it would impose some restrictions on Jab Jab. There is a specific time for the Jab Jab ban to perform, which of course would distort and disable Jab Jab's grammar of resistance, as Jab Jab cannot perform during Juve. Jab Jab cannot practice during Juve. Jab Jab cannot practice during the days leading up to Carnival. Jab Jab has a window to perform and to practice, a 2-hour window. There are start and end times for these performances. There is a fee that the Jab Jab bands now have to pay. And so certainly these restrictions would also be part of the trigger for the resistance effort that took place during the COVID-19 Cancellation Act. So there is certainly a way in which Jab Jab did respond to that kind of injustice, to its performance strategies and its grammar of resistance, as I call it. Of course, this argument in terms of the tensions that we see with Jab Jab is very broad in terms of its marketing and how it is commercialized in the Grenadian society for the tourist gaze and for a regional audience. The idea here is that people are split in terms of how they view the commercialization of Jab Jab. There is support for the commercialization because Jab Jab is an important part of Grenada's cultural economy and heritage tourism. It does attract revenue for Grenada and visitors to the island broadly, right? So, and then of course, you do have the other part of this argument, and a line in that is that if you commercialize it too much, you are taking it out of the hands of its grassroots agency, out of the hands of the people. and that the people do not always benefit from, let's say, jab's exposure to an international audience overseas originally. The revenues do not come to the mass of the people. So it's a very long argument concerning this sort of commercialization, but the work does consider that these restrictions on jab itself was part of the resistance to the COVID-19 cancellation. It was a very long set of, grievances that jab had
Thank you.
to conditions in the society. Yeah.
Thank you, Candia. We do have another question for you. How is
Okay.
the Grenada jab related to other practices such as Lancet Cod, the Haitian post-enslavement tradition, as well as similar in Martinique and Guadeloupe?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great question. Jab is part of the Afro-diasporic response to injustice, and there are several throughout the Caribbean, in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, in Haiti, in Trinidad, and they respond to conditions in the society. They blacken the body to assert in a very literal, but also in a very social way, that jab, or whether it is Meg Maron, is critical to explaining and speaking to and about the social conditions and the economic conditions in the society. I think that in the Caribbean, we do have performance cultures in which jab and other forms of Black cultural expressions do center and play a critical role in making their own contribution to the dissatisfactions that they have within the society. I mean, I have been considering looking at Black cultural expressions in the diaspora in a very broad way. And commemorations in Haiti, in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, in Trinidad will also be quite important to this kind of conversation.
Thank you so much. Since there are no other questions at this time, I would ask a question, and all of you can feel free to give your response. Uh, what are the common misconceptions about your topic, and how does your topic connect to current events or trends?
I think the common misconception, as I said at the beginning, Jenny, where we think we divorce literature from discussion around political and social topics such as emancipation. So I think that misconception that it's just an abstract, it doesn't really serve a person, it does a purpose, it's not tangible. And I think it serves a purpose in trends because of the conversation that we're having right now and the way we talk about even the impacts of this idea about, are we emancipated, are we liberated? When we see in Annie John, for example, we're still having the educational system that is very much planted within a Euro-British context, and we're still having that discussion about, bringing Marcus Garvey into school, making it, even though we've Caribbeanized it through the CXCRK examination, we're still having discussion about how do we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, so to speak. And one way would be the education system. I think Annie John does that very well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Geneve. Common misconceptions, the paper does deal with that too, that jab is opial, that jab is a form of devil worship. It really does deny sections of the Black community, the Christian community in particular, from understanding the historical and the sociocultural and even the economic significance of jab and what jab tries to do for the society as an outlet, as an avenue to talk about its own conditions and the conditions very broadly across time and space. I think that that kind of perception, what it does in the society is that it creates a kind of divide. Non-jab supporters, proponents, and of course, those who are antagonists and against jab. And these clear divides are very hard lines. You rarely have people who are part of the Christian community who may dare to engage in jab in this sort of way without ridicule. There are people who may engage in it knowing fully well that they would be criticized and they're part of the Christian community. But there is also a very hard line in which there are members of the Christian community who dare not consider participating in jab because the misconception around it is that it has been demonized. It's one of the Afro cultural expressions that are demonizing the Grenadian society, and it is the most contested. Although, of course, jab is also the way in which Grenada markets itself, its cultural economy, its heritage, tourism, cultural heritage is shaped around Grenada as the home of jab, the nation of jab, 100,000 jab. And years ago, when that kind of narrative was used to describe Grenada's identity, Christian community argued that jab is an un-Christian element of Grenadian society. And so it has to be continued to be outlawed. And on the books, of course, jab has been banned as superstitious, as being part of demonstrating witchcraft or as obia. And some of its symbolisms have also been outlawed. The drumming, the dancing, the use of snakes, the use of the reddening of the mouth, and its grotesque symbolisms that it uses to mock and satirize the society has been outlawed in our law books. So there is certainly a space that these works open up when it comes to policy and how we wish to think about our identity moving forward, how we wish to negotiate the parts of the Black self that we have denied for a very long time due to colonization and slavery.
Thank you. Thank you. Shani, over to you, and then to you, O'Neill.
Yeah. So just very briefly, I think one of the cultural landscape is a very policy, practice, the ways in which we understand our society is evolving, and the tensions over time. I think it's an ever-present, ongoing issue. It's not just things like carnival or jab or the banning of obia. It's also how we treat our built heritage and so on. So I think the questions around research and thinking about marrying different methodological approaches or subject approaches in the case for this project, which is really in response to a contemporary policy issue, is very important. And what we do as practitioners is to show that things are continuous. So the fact that things happened, emancipation happened, that, slavery ended, does not fundamentally result in a change in society. And in many ways, we are struggling in countries where you have a Black majority population. We are actually struggling to work through those historic relationships, whether it's we're going to ban something as obia or we're going to think about a distance between literature and the present, that we have to constantly challenge us by creating work that responds to some of the contemporary issues that we're navigating as practitioners.
Thank you so much. O'Neill.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your presentation. Excellent presentation. But I have more of a comment than a question. And Dr. Roper in her presentation spoke about emancipation being contested and reinvented. Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
All right, good. So she spoke about contested and reinvented, but while this project was actually taking place about Emancipation Day matters, in the Cayman Islands, Emancipation Day was actually reinstated in, I believe, 2021 or 2022, around that period, after it was suspended for about 62 or 63 years. And that reinstatement in the Cayman Islands was a result of the hard work that was done by persons like Dr. Christopher Williams, Roy Bodden, Livingston Smith, and I could even say myself, but because even not to say much about myself, but I've written an article in the University of the Cayman Islands Journal about Pedro St. James and the fact that Cayman, which is a largely mixed society, ignores the Afrocentric elements within the Cayman Islands. When I went to the the Great House, Pedro St. James in Cayman, I observed that the white graveyard where the white settled was well kept. However, when you look at this part where the African or the enslaved persons were buried, they removed everything and it was turned into a car park for the Great House. And within that article, I called for the Cayman Islands to reinstate Emancipation Day as a national holiday. So I'm happy that Cayman has moved forward through the advocacy of the small group of scholars from the University College of the Cayman Islands.
Thank you for that, O'Neill. And we will celebrate, I'm currently based in the Cayman Islands, so we will celebrate Emancipation on the 5th of May, next Monday. So I'm not sure if this is my Dr. Williams on the line this evening, but definitely a major advocate for these types of conversations around Cayman's history and culture. O'Neill, do we have time for two more questions? I am mindful of people's time and very much appreciative of the fact that persons have taken time out of their busy schedules to join us this evening. So I'll just attend to two more questions. Okama has asked whether there's any relationship between Jab Jab and Sinterklaas celebrations of the Dutch Caribbean. It could be a new angle to study such cultural expression. I have my own thoughts on that, but I would yield to the panelists. And another question, what one thing on emancipation in the Caribbean? I believe this might be one thing on emancipation. Can you give a specific cultural identity other than Jab Jab that speaks to real emancipation from colonialism? And
tough question.
I thought it was a tough question too, but I could see some attempts. I think if the Caribbean follow suit like St. Lucia and Haiti and officialize our creoles, I think that would be a real emancipation from colonialism, because linguistically our language has, while it has elements of the colonizer, it has morphed into itself. So I think it's just for our government to say, you know what, Jamaica, we're just gonna have our creoles as an official language. I think that step would really mark, for me, a true, real emancipation from colonialism.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Shana.
I have a different perspective to that, because the performative component of our cultural identity is only one way in which we engage in an expression around emancipation. I mean, emancipation was celebrated. Emancipation Day was consistently celebrated in the first 50 years throughout the region, not just with carnivals or whatever, but also through church services, right? It is what makes Emancipation Day a contested day of memory is the fact that in the construction of statehood, the notion of emancipation is rejected. So it's not just a performance issue. It is actually an identity issue. And it is a rejection. It's almost as if, I mean, in the Jamaican context, it was deliberately constructed. The Jamaican state was conceptualized as a state moving beyond the struggle of the past that is grounded in a Black radical ethos. So in my mind, to become an independent, civilized nation, one must reject legacies of enslavement, most aptly recognized in Emancipation Day, which is why Emancipation Day has to be constantly reinstated. Constantly. This is not a specific problem to Jamaica. It's definitely not specific to Cayman. It's not. Nations have had to be deliberate in celebrating Emancipation Day. And so, if we focus on the performative, we don't see the ways in which policy and statehood and national identity works as a form of anti-Blackness, which is really what Emancipation Day is, a Black celebration. So that's my kind of take on the question. If we limit it to performativeness, then we don't have a big picture. But I do think, and I know the previous question will be closer to Candia, but I do think that what our effort yielded was the importance of having these cross sub-region discussions around performative Black identity that are in conversation each other. So we can write about it individually within our own places. We start writing together about it. We then have a different, we can view our relationships differently, and we can see similarities while acknowledging that things are not necessarily the same because of the different contexts in which we function. So
Thank you so much. Really appreciate those insights. I don't see any more questions. I don't know if anyone wanted to elaborate on Sinterklaas celebrations in the Dutch Caribbean and any comparisons.
There was
Once
a question higher up about the emblems and symbolisms of Jab Jab that someone raised. I saw it a while ago. I
I'm just
cannot
seeing
remember
that.
seeing
How
it.
do
Where
objects
is it? I saw it. I'm trying to, yes, objects used and how
Jab
they
Jab reflect the meaning and symbolism? And that
reflect
will be our final question.
reflect the meaning and symbolism. So these are all emblems that are grotesque, and they act as forms of resistance to polite society and the kinds of ways in which the elite would seek to quote unquote civilize the society. And so for the elites in the society, the use of these emblems would suggest that emancipation had failed, that the mass of the people had not been civilized by the kind of emancipation that the British Parliament had sought to pass on to the Black community. I think the snakes, the frogs, the saltfish, the chains, the blings, and so on, what they do is that they speak to the conditions of Jab Jab. And Jab Jab is saying, we live in hell. And so we're going to use these kinds of expressions to reflect the hell in which we live. They are quite literal, but of course they do have very wide and large symbolic meanings in terms of how Jab Jab wishes to talk about how bad and poor their conditions have been. And so what they do is that they present a sort of heightened, grotesque way to speak about the Jab Jab conditions in the society. And they do it because the whites, the elites in the society, looking on at these grotesque emblems, of course, they are quite incensed that Jab Jab dare to use these kinds of emblems to represent whatever meaning they hope to represent, whether it is poor conditions, whether it is about the cancellation of Carnival itself, whether it is Jab Jab being banned as a form of obia, etc. Of course, these expressions here, the snakes, the frogs, the saltfish, and so on, were also banned and considered as superstitious elements that the Black community often use to speak to, according to the elites, what they saw as witchcraft and obia. So the use of it is a defiance. It is a form of resistance, again, contestation of Euro Creole cultural expressions and ideas concerning Black respectability.
Thank you. Okama, I will give the very final question to you and then we must wrap up. I do want to respect everyone's time that they've spent with us here this evening. So, Okama, please proceed.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Wonderful presentations. I just wanted to pose a question to the panelists and for future series as well, because these dialogue sessions is about bridging knowledge across borders. And I wanted to know what you all think could be an avenue for sharing these knowledges with, Africans in the continent. Because I am from Nigeria, and it was only when I came to the Caribbean for the first time I realized the word, the name Obia, actually means something negative. Because Obia is my grandmother's name, and we spell it Obia. And my daughter, my only daughter, is named after my grandmother. Her name is Zanzi Obia. And so, I've always, confronted this linguistic terminologies and the negative connotations that it has for how some of these, expressions take place in the Caribbean as compared to the original intent in the African context. So I just wanted to share that and to tease your brains on how perhaps we can share this, because when I go back home and I tell my people what some of the things I've learned are all about, and sometimes they can't believe me. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I just ask one of the panelists to take this question from our immediate past president before we conclude.
Well, for one, we need cheaper tickets. We need cheaper tickets to Africa. It's too expensive to get there. And lots of people want to go to Africa, but it's too expensive.
Can't afford it.
Yeah, but I think exchange, academic exchange, artists in residence, I think these are good ways in which we could bridge gaps. We have the social media now, technology. I think we have to use it to our advantage and cheap fare. And that's it.
Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to conclude for this evening and really thank you to our amazing panelists. We thoroughly enjoyed these sessions, learning more and your knowledge sharing about emancipation, and to be able to have a broad overview of the Caribbean space and how the topic is confronted and dealt with in our region, and look forward to hearing so much more of it at the St. Martin Conference. Thanks to all our attendees for taking the time to join us here this evening. And of course, Dr. O'Neill Hall, who has conceptualized this series for us on behalf of the Caribbean Studies Association and the executive. Thanks to everyone. O'Neill, I don't know, there was a video to share on the St. Martin Conference. I don't know if you wanted to end with that or if that is no longer happening. I say good evening to everyone and do enjoy the rest of your week.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. No video.
Okay. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Bye,
everyone.
everyone.